In this video, I'm going to give you a little bit of help in setting up the problems for the density worksheet. And this is not in either of the Unit 1 packet. So it's not in the notes packet and it's not in the coursework packet. It was a separate worksheet that I sent out. So density, there's really only three variables in density. You have density equals mass over volume. All right, so what's going to happen sometimes is you might have to solve for either mass or volume. So this is one of the equations, and you're going to have a total of three equations you can pick from, really. So this is giving us density equals mass over volume. Now let's say the problem is asking us to solve for mass. Let's say it gives you density, it gives you volume, and it asks you for mass. Well, what you're going to have to do is rearrange that equation for the mass. All right, so if we want to figure out the mass, we have to get that by itself. So to do that, what you'd have to do is multiply both sides by the volume, because I want this volume to cancel out. And whatever you do to one side, you have to do to the other. So now you have volume times density equals mass. Where should you prefer to think about it? It's mass equals density times volume. Now, hopefully that makes sense, because what I always like to say is you want to pay attention to the units when you're doing the problem. So let's say we have the units of grams per milliliter. You know what? I'll write it differently. I'll write it like this. Grams per milliliter for the density. And then the volume is going to be measured in milliliters. And really what happens is if you have one thing up top and that same unit in the bottom in a fraction, they end up canceling out. And what you'll be left with is grams. So this is another equation that you'll use. So right now we have density equals mass over volume. We have mass equals density times volume. And now we're going to start over again and solve for density. So let's start back with this density equals mass over volume equation. So now if I'm trying to find the volume, I want to get that by itself, but there's a problem here. It is in the denominator, and I don't want it in the denominator, the bottom of a fraction. So what I have to do is multiply both sides by volume, because I don't want it on the bottom. And now what I have is volume times density equals mass. And now I have to divide both sides by density, because I want density out of there, because I want volume by itself. So what I get is volume equals mass divided by density. And now if I think about the units again, mass would be measured in something like grams, density would be grams per milliliter. Now the grams is up top and in the bottom, so that would cancel out. And what happens here is the milliliters, the volume, is in the denominator of a denominator. So that would basically swing up and become the units, which makes sense. If you're looking for volume, you should expect that something like milliliters or liters or cubic centimeters or whatever the case is, some unit of volume. So this is the other equation. So these are the three equations. You have the original density equation, you have the equation for mass, and you have the equation for volume. They're the only three equations you're really going to need on this page. So when you're doing these problems, what I think works well is identify the variables in the problem. This first one, it's saying what is the density? Well, that's telling you right away that's what you're solving for. So you're going to need that equation. It gives you the mass, right? It says mass of 15 grams, volume of 4.6 milliliters. So that's pretty straightforward. It's just giving you exactly what you need that you can then plug into the equation. Now number two, it's saying what is the mass? All right, well now that one is telling us we have to go to that equation. So let's see if it gives us all of the information. Okay, it gives us the density, which is that first part, and it gives us volume, which is the second part of the equation. So it's going to help if you end up doing it like this, I think. So what is the volume? It's asking us for volume. So that means for number 3, you're going to need this equation. Tells us the density, tells us the mass, and then you can go through it. So just pay attention to what it's asking you to solve for and what it's giving you. Now on the next page, and yes, there are two pages to this. This table here sometimes throws people off. Let's see. Okay, it's basically walking you through the steps. It's telling you someone was doing an experiment, and they have this empty graduated cylinder, and they got the mass of it. And then they added liquid to the graduated cylinder and got the mass of that, just using a triple beam balance or whatever the case is, or an electronic balance. And then they could just read the volume off of the graduated cylinder like we've been doing for practice, where you look at where the meniscus is on the graduated cylinders, all the lines, right? The meniscus is at a certain point. That's how they would get the volume. So what you're going to end up doing is using these two numbers here to figure out the mass. Right, just think about it. It's actually pretty easy to do. There's no multiplication. All you're doing is a subtraction there. And then the volume of the liquid, it just tells you it right away. So this letter A here is asking you how you got that number using those two data values. And then letter B is just asking you for density, which is mass and volume. And you're just using the information you got from up here for it. Now for letter C at the bottom, what is your unknown? You're just going to pick the one that is closest to the density that you calculated up here. All right, that's how you set it up. Remember, there's only really 3 variations of the density equation.